First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to present at this conference. I would like also to give a special thanks to organizers for this immense effort to put something new together in such unusual times. So thank you very much. This is joint work with Gian Gao and from the University of Melbourne and Dave Larker from Stanford. And what we're trying to do in this paper, we're essentially trying to develop a new measure of disclosure. And we're trying to develop this new measure of disclosure by looking at non-answers during conference calls. So according to common dictionary definitions, non-answers are essentially lack of answer or the answer that doesn't contain information requested. Non-answers come in very different shapes and forms. Non-answers can be explicit phrases that I'm not going to provide information, such as we are not going to comment on this, I refuse to provide details, we don't disclose these numbers. Or you can essentially say that I don't know the answer. And then I would say, I'm unable to say, it's too early to tell. There are also different types of non-answers, such as one is kind of one of the Elon Musk's favorite, which is essentially just interrupting the speaker, not letting speaker to finish the question, and this what he does sometimes during the conference calls. Another ways of not answering questions is just to answer, but a different question. So just to provide different piece of information. So what we're trying to do in this paper, we are going to focus on a very narrow subset of non-answers, and we will essentially look at explicit phrases for not providing information. And we are going to use conference calls for this. Why conference calls? Because conference calls contain a question and answer section. So question essentially would ask for a specific piece of information, and an answer, we will look whether an answer contains non-answer or not. And then we also try to see if this measure has anything to do with disclosure and whether it behaves as disclosure measures are supposed to behave. So essentially, this paper relates to disclosure research. There's large literature on disclosure. And the basic idea is essentially that firms disclose information publicly to capital market. And this disclosed information, when it's disclosed publicly, it can be used also by product market rivals. Like companies' competitors can listen to this publicly disclosed information and use it to its advantage. So public disclosure information creates these proprietary costs. That was basic idea from Virekia in 1983, but then there was proliferation of different theory papers, and there can be written models which have mixed predictions that would say more disclosure, more competition leads to less disclosure, or more competition leads to more disclosure, depending on the specific piece of information. It's also very hard to test the theories in disclosure research because we don't know if it's truthful disclosure or if it's a cheap talk. And one of the issues that we are trying to address in this paper is we essentially look more carefully at the measurement, and specifically we are focusing on developing a new measure of disclosure. Our measure of disclosure complements all these other existing measures, which have their own benefits and costs, such as the most popular measures of disclosures are Analyst rating for disclosure. Then literature often also likes to use management forecasts, properties of management forecasts, their frequency, other measures such as properties of earnings, their persistence, conservatism, segment disclosure, reduction of disclosure from company filings, and tone of disclosure. So all of these measures were suggested as a measure of disclosure, but they also come with some benefits and some costs, such as ratings of disclosure, such as analyst ratings of disclosure. They're essentially no longer available. They stopped being provided in about 1997, so there's no such measure anymore. Then if papers look at regulation or changes in disclosure regulation, these changes in disclosure regulation come rarely. Then some of these measures, such as properties of earnings, mix disclosure choices and consequences of such choices. So earnings are conditional on some firm disclosure policy, and at the same time, the properties of earnings are also disclosure itself. There's also the problem with management forecasts, management guidance, is that they are low frequency decisions, because typically companies would adopt some particular policies around management disclosure, and there's also to a large extent subject to inertia. For instance, the 10K disclosures, annual reports do not change that often. And they often also mix voluntary and mandatory disclosure choices, because many of these disclosures, like some press releases, have to be also disclosed in mandatory forms, which are 8K filings. So here's where our measure comes in. Our measure has different properties. We believe it to be much higher frequency measure. So like conference calls are quarterly, but at the same time, one conference call would have multiple questions. So you can think about question as requesting particular type of information, and then answer as like a disclosure choice. Should I provide this particular piece of information or shouldn't I? So it's much, much higher frequency disclosure decision. Conference calls became widespread after regulation fair disclosure. They also, the sources for conference calls are very standard, kind of standard at this point. There are a few providers for conference calls transcripts, and conference calls, in addition to the presentation section, also contain the Q&A section, which is essentially contain this interaction between analysts and managers. So again, out of all this myriad of possible non-answers, such as Elon Musk's favorite interruptions of the question, we focus on very specific question or very specific non-answers, and these non-answers fall into three categories. But I want you to know that these three categories, the differences between these three categories are very blurred. Some of these phrases can belong to both refusals and unable to answer. For this reason, we will study all these non-answers together. We are not going to consider separate categories, because they are mostly kind of the same. Similar non-answers can be placed into these different categories. But when we started developing the measure, we were trying to focus on them being separate. And these are refusals to answer. What the type of phrases that we are going to capture is, say, at this stage, we are not discussing the details of the financial figures yet. Yes, I don't think I can comment on the ratios. Unable to answer. At this point, it's too early to comment, or talk after the conference call, such as, can we take that offline? So essentially, we would focus on these explicit refusals to provide information. And we are going to go about it as follows. We are going to take the random subset of answers, and we will have humans label this random subset of answers of whether they contain non-answers, and if they contain non-answers, what phrase identifies that this answer contains non-answer. So this is extremely labor-intensive part. And we were doing it using Crowdflower. Crowdflower is sort of like elevated mTurk. In Crowdflower, the taggers have some reputation, and we can filter on the quality of their work. So we have every answer we have tagged by 2 Crowdflower taggers, and then we also have the University of Chicago Research Assistant to reconcile the differences and do additional tagging. So the way we are going to develop this measure, we will have training set on which we are going to develop regular expressions, and then we'll have test set that was not used at all in developing the measure, and we're just going to estimate the performance of the classifier for non-answers that we developed on this test set. So this is how our regular expressions look like. Looks complicated, but essentially what it is, it's a type of the grammatical form, and then this grammatical form will have certain dictionaries. So we'll have dictionaries of disclosure words such as we don't comment, we don't disclose, we don't provide details. So it will have this combination of regular expressions, and then we'll have dictionaries plugged into these regular expressions. The development of these regular expressions was quite involved. It required a lot of human judgment. And then, and this is what we came up with. So we essentially were developing regular expressions on the training set. Once the accuracy in the training set was achieved at 90%, accuracy, we took it to the test set and just see how it performed on the test set on absolutely the new data that we haven't looked at when we developed the classifier. And this is our out-of-sample accuracy. It uses the random set of 500 answers. The out-of-sample accuracy is also close to 90. This is what we had in sample. The out-of-sample true positive rate is about 78%. So that essentially means that we are not able to detect about 20% of non-answers, and then out-of-sample precision is about 58. So what this essentially means, precision means that our classifier says this answer is no answer or non-answer. So we look at all non-answers and see which proportion of those which are tagged as a non-answer actually are non-answers, and 58 is this proportion. So this classifier clearly not perfect. However, if we compare the performance on the training set and the performance on test set, this drop in classification performance statistics is not that large. And so that gives some assurance that we haven't overfitted the training. We haven't overfitted the training data much. And at the same time, the next question we can ask, how do machine learning approaches perform relative to our regular expressions? Regular expressions, a lot of manual work. Why don't we just ask the machine to figure out what non-answer is? So this is exactly what we are doing in the slide. The top line is out-of-sample performance of our regular expressions. The bottom lines are essentially different machine learning approaches. So we use lasso regression, reach, elastic net, other boost. These 4 categories essentially use different features. As features, we use dictionary words from dictionaries such as Gurun and McDonald dictionary, uncertainty, fog, all these different kinds of words, just plug them, just dump them into these statistical approaches and see what comes out. The approach which is different from the top 4, which is lasso, reach, elastic net, other boost, is naive Bayes. So naive Bayes essentially tries from the frequency of words, tries to predict whether it's answer and non-answer. So naive Bayes is not tied to any of the dictionaries. Like all other lasso, reach, elastic net, other boost, are essentially tied to some dictionaries. Naive Bayes just go out there, here's the whole corpus, figure out what non-answer is. So what we see from this table is essentially that none of the machine learning approaches dominates regular expressions. The only one which comes close is other boost. This is considered one of the most powerful machine learning methods. So accuracy is about 90, true positive rate is lower, but precision is higher. So there's a trade-off between true positive rate and precision, but nothing which spectacular and dominates regular expressions. At the same time, one of the more popular approaches, which is naive Bayes, does very poorly, despite the fact that it achieves accuracy at 80%, its true positive rate is 11%. It means it misses 90% of non-answers, and precision is also very poor. So like thinking that we could just take out of the box naive Bayes, no need to come up with a feature, just plug answers, non-answer in, see what it figures out, it does very poorly. And then we also find that if we look, say, at what lasso regression ended up choosing among the features that we gave to lasso, the top 6 performers, the top 6 predictors in lasso are essentially our regular expressions. So despite the fact that there's quite a bit of human judgment was involved when we developed this training set, these regular expressions do make some sense and are capable of capturing non-answers the way we define them in the tagged corpus. So the next question is, despite all this error, does it behave as a disclosure? Can we learn anything useful for the disclosure research? So first, what is interesting is that non-answer rate is stable over time. It's around 11%, so that means that 11% of a typical conference call answers would contain the explicit non-answer phrases. And so it seems stable, not that inspiring in terms of does it behave as a disclosure measure, does it vary the way it's supposed to vary. The next thing we will look at is essentially how non-answers behave depending on question features. So because this measure is on the question level, we can look at what type of information was asked in the question and whether the question was answered. So here what we find is that, and here we can include call fixed effects because there are multiple questions per call. So essentially just examine the variation within the call for different questions. So that means we take account of all firm time-specific characteristics and call-specific characteristics. So what we find is that negative tone questions are more likely to stay unanswered. The questions which contain a lot of uncertainty words and more complicated to understand, they are also more likely to stay unanswered. The other interesting part, that questions that ask for details, such as the questions that contain numbers, money or percent, location, date, and time, they typically go unanswered. And then we essentially, just to align it, to tie it back to disclosure research, we ask the question whether non-answers behave as this disclosure is supposed to behave in terms of in relation to performance and in relation to product market competition. So the way we are doing it, we essentially can study non-answer behavior on the level of a call and on the level of the question. For the call level analysis, we include a bunch of controls. We include call fixed effects. We essentially look at the proportion of answers during the conference calls which are non-answers. And the prior literature finds that companies are more forthcoming when they have positive news, but there's also other research which says companies are preempting the negative news and they would be more forthcoming in anticipation of negative news. Here we find these findings are in line with the literature which essentially says firms are more willing to talk when they are willing to share positive news. So indeed, if the company reports a loss, they are more likely not to answer questions, but any measures of financial performance, such as current measures, such as return on assets, and any future measures, return on assets, next quarter, future profitability, they all reduce the propensity of non-answers, or in other words, if the companies have positive news to convey, they are more likely to answer questions during conference calls. Then we do the same with question level analysis. So now we essentially look at whether question is performance related. Performance related means it contains financial terms from some other prior research, financial terms, and we look whether if the question about something financial and performance is good or bad, whether the propensity of non-answers changes. And indeed it's the case, performance related questions on average more likely to stay unanswered. However, when the company is conveying good news, it's more likely to answer these questions. Then we would repeat the same analysis for competition, and research on competition had a lot of mixed findings. They found negative, positive, or non-existent association for competition. One of the arguments was that there are issues with measure of disclosure, but the most important argument was that there are issues with how to measure competition. So we are going to measure competition similar to prior research, which is Herfindahl index, but we also will use new measures of competition, which is product market competition by Hobert and Phillips, and also we will count as in Lee et al. Paper the frequency of competition-related words during the conference calls, and based on this old measure, which is Herfindahl index, and also new measures such as log similarity, which is textual similarity, textual product similarity from Hobert and Phillips, and the frequency of competition-related words, all of these measures, we find that more competition is associated to is related to less disclosure. For HHI, the sign is negative because high HHI means more competition, so the relationship is supposed to flip. And then we also bring these findings to question level analysis. Here we will talk proprietary information questions, which is essentially we will use Stanford name entity recognizer, which has organizations category, And this organizations category contains product names. We have checked it with arrays. It also contains competitors or partners or collaborators for the company. Indeed, we find that if question is proprietary information related, it's more likely to stay unanswered if competition is higher. And to conclude, this paper, there is mixed evidence with respect to disclosure in prior research. This paper is trying to offer a new disclosure measure, which is on much higher frequency, so it provides powerful tests such as inclusion of call fixed effects, and also allows to test new hypotheses with respect to what type of information was demanded in the question and whether the question was answered or not. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anastasia, for the talk. Our discussant for the paper will be Umit Gurun from UT Dallas. Umit, you have 15 minutes.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for the conference organizers for inviting me. This is the first time that I'm going to do such a thing, so I'm hoping that nothing unexpected will happen. Again, Anastasia did a really good job. So I just want to summarize what they show in this paper. So essentially, they are developing a novel measure of disclosure to measure whether a manager is kind of responding to an asked question or not. So this we call them non-answer. So it's measured in a different way, in a couple of different ways. So the data is 2012 to 16, about 3,000 firms, 80,000 conference calls, about 2.5 million question answer pairs. So this is a very detailed sample. So the main finding is essentially 11% of the questions go unanswered, and this seems to be very stable over time, and across the industry. So there seems to be something about this 11%. So 1 out of 10 question really gets out of the way, and just the issue is is it important, whether we care about the what constitutes an unanswer, is the lower bound or upper bound, and so on. So they have really detailed analysis about how to create this measure. And then just once the authors create this measure, they try to show what is it correlated with. Just as my prior expectation was obviously these things will spike up when you have some sort of if the question is negative, then you are likely to give a negative tone, greater uncertainty, greater complexity. Just these are the things that are highly correlated with the unanswered component of the conference call. So a big literature in the accounting is essentially when you have this disclosure from the firm to the industry or to the marketplace. Why does it matter? Do you think that managers are more forthcoming with the information if the industry is competitive, or if you are not performing well, do you tend to speak less a little bit more, or do you pound sort of the desk, just more, or you are more forthcoming with the information if you are performing well? So these are kind of first order questions in accounting literature. So one natural thing when you have such a measure is to look at how it performs, how is it related to these hypotheses, proprietary information hypotheses. That's kind of a big question in the accounting literature. So before the paper, there was one paper that sort of did a similar analysis, much smaller sample, much shorter time period, and they defined the non-answer as kind of if a sort of conference call has at least one question which goes unanswered, they mark that conference as kind of unanswered. So by the same metric, this paper is kind of 92% because they do a really good job of teasing out the questions that are probably marked as answered in the calendar paper. So and there's what they do is they try to see whether the market seems to be paying attention to this non-response, whether this is kind of bad news. No news is bad news. If I'm not speaking about something that the analysts want to know, then the market's perception of this kind of an issue is, it must be bad, right? So there's that kind of analysis. So they go above and beyond this paper, and they basically provide additional context into just this disclosure mechanism. Now, we should remember when you get a non-answer, let's say, if I ask something to my wife and she doesn't give an answer, in that context, it means that she's mad at me, okay? But in the corporate context, when a manager who is supposed to answer the question, because like it's not like, you know, calling out of blue, like you're supposed to be there to answer the analyst question, who are doing you a favor of like, you know, covering your firm, communicating your messages to the marketplace. So this is kind of like, you know, a place where, you know, just you have, you know, just prior notice about like what the issues are. So you are basically prepared, but you choose not to answer some of the questions. So it's in the corporate context, you know, just like the way that they are measuring, like either you refuse, you're unable to answer, or you just like, you know, say like we are going to talk about it later on. So these are the types of like just like these are the things that they can measure with this technique. And this seems to be kind of like related to the extreme form of dodging. So sometimes, you know, just especially like in seminars, like, you know, just when you ask me a question, like, you know, I can find a way to answer it in the way that I am sort of like, you know, I set it up in my mind. So I'm not answering your question, but I am answering to the question. And like Trump does it really well. So that we know that, you know, politicians are really good at like, you know, this dodging. So so non-answer seems to be kind of like extreme form of dodging in some way. So like my guess is this 10% is kind of a like lower bound in some sense. Like if you think about whether or not the questions are being really answered. So I'm pretty sure in that 90%, the answers are not really satisfactory in some form. So the issue is like, you know, like if we go down this channel of like identifying which questions are being answered or not, you know, there is also still a gray area that may be useful, like with some other technique. So in that sense, you know, it's just kind of related to this literature that talks about like ambiguous language in the like 10Ks, 8Ks, or the analyst calls. There's like Josh Lee has a paper about spontaneity, like which managers seem to be spontaneous in the conference calls. You ask them a question like a curveball, and they are able to sort of like answer it because like they are so on top of it. So like they are kind of ready. Not every managers are created equally. So that's basically one way. Or like use of euphemisms, like kind of like they're using some sort of like way to again communicate this bad information in some creative way. You know, like there has been some work. So non-answer seems to be kind of like correlated with these views of like understanding the like, you know, this communication mechanism. So if you try to sort of look at this similar concept in different domains, like if they like people have looked at the politicians, whether they are trying to escape detection, like are they sort of like dodging the questions. So in that literature, basically, if you are avoiding a topic, you know, it further increases interest. So like in a way, yes, you could dodge the question, or you could say no answer, but you know, at the cost of like creating attention on that topic. So it's not really clear whether or not like, you know, dodging is going to buy you something. So that it's a very dynamic environment. So in a way, I guess like one thing that I think like I would like to sort of a place where the authors are underselling their paper is like, is there a market design to solution to this problem? So I think, you know, like 10% is kind of lower end of this, like, you know, just non-response in an environment where you are supposed to respond. So can we sort of like, you know, just allow the questions to be submitted earlier so that like you can tease out like some of these non-answers, like, you know, is it being lack of preparation? Like if it's quantitative, just like the way that Anastasia was showing, like maybe if they prepare for this, maybe like we can get rid of some of these problems. So maybe the regulator can step in and say, look, you know, here's sort of like what you want to do, like, you know, here are the questions that you are going to receive, like maybe like from the analyst, and there will be some questions demanded, so you can still not respond them, but at least like we eliminate this potential mechanism where you are not ready, right? So like we also see like in these conference calls, sometimes like analysts are sort of repeating the other's question if there is no response, like, you know, we really want to know about it. So like, you know, just is it possible to like, you know, you know, just like have some sort of like mechanism where you allow repeat questions, so you sort of corner the manager if they are really very reluctant to sort of like speak about an issue. So or like, you know, allow the managers to sort of have some sort of like post conference, you know, channels, like here are the questions that were not answered, but you know, just here's a way to sort of like disseminate this information later on. So again, you know, just like my first comment is, so like, yeah, there could be some potentially important implications for regulators, and that could be sort of emphasized in the paper. So I guess like from like big question part, I guess like that's kind of what the paper should go. And the second one is like, what is the baseline? Like if you think about, just dodging for politicians, is it 50%? For academic talks, like when people come and talk to the University of Chicago, like, just like, do you see like 5% of the questions go unnoticed? So again, this is kind of like, I wonder like, how this is like in general in life, so that like we know whether this is a big issue or not. So another thing is, just this is kind of like, again, think about why is it not being answered? I mean, the first issue is like, strategic withholding of information, but there could be the issues about the venue, like information is available elsewhere. Like, you ask this question, but look, we talked about it in 8K, or like, is it coming from a hostile analyst? Is it really, like, there are numerous things that could be done. But the paper is kind of clever, just I'm clever in the sense that like they say, look, there are like, this is from the conclusion, seeming the innumerable features of question can be explored, such as the topic of the question, who is asking it, is it favored analyst, is it quantitative call? So like, they don't want to get into that corner, and they just say like, this is for future. But I think, there's a lot of things that could like, be important here, because like, these are important covariates that may affect your, analysis. For example, if you have a hostile analyst, and if you sort of like put that guy at the end, the time is limited, then you don't really leave too much of a time. Like, people sort of get that message as like, we are not being answered, but could it be because of the time limitation, or is it because like you are the hostile? So I guess like, you may want to sort of, at least within the call analysis, like the sequence of the call and so on. So those are the things that I wouldn't really delegate to a different paper. Like, I would try to like, give those answers, because like this is super interesting. So another thing, like the main sort of top part of the analysis is about the strategic withholding of information. So again, they use a classifier to identify the unanswered question. So here, like, I want to really know like what is being answered and what is not being answered here. Like, just there is no analysis of like, okay, here's the proprietary information, and I choose to answer, and it's supposed to hurt me. That's kind of how the literature goes. So like, maybe like, if this is a paper a little bit about proprietary information, maybe like you want to investigate like what is being answered and how does that relate to like, other metrics that have been proposed in the literature as kind of proprietary information. So again, just digging more into data to tell us more about what seems to be preferred, by the analyst, by the manager to be answered. I guess that will be some richness. So again, just that this literature finds a negative or positive correlation between competition and the disclosure. So they are sort of inserting themselves into this discussion. And, in this analysis, just most of the regressions don't have firm fixed effects. And they do have a short discussion saying that it seems to absorb a lot of variation. I think, there should be more discussion about this. Obviously, this seems to be very stable across time and across industries. So if it's not really varying a lot, then, I want to like, you may want to look at the spikes in this measure. Like, just you are a company which seems to like answer 1 out of 10 question, or like none answer 1 out of 10. Suddenly it goes up to 30% of questions. Is it before the product launches? Is it before the mergers, after the mergers, before the bankruptcy? So times where the competition structure changes. So this China analysis is interesting, but maybe you could do like give some convincing evidence around certain environment. So that could sort of provide some texture to that part of analysis, but that's where you choose to sort of concentrate. So again, so it's a very interesting paper. So it needs to be tied to some of the other work that has been done in terms of like, looking at the content of the calls. So after that, so I'm convinced that this non-response is really important, but just why is this happening is kind of still a question mark. So more analysis could shed light on this. So like, just punting the ball on that to other papers, like it's kind of, I mean, not many people will be able to create this data set. So since you have it, like it will be useful to maybe provide that in one paper, and then, just that will be really, really interesting. So, and then it does open a lot of like potential, like a lot of sort of question marks, potential questions to be answered for the future. So I believe, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Umit, for this rich discussion. Anastasia, would you like to respond briefly before we move on to the Q&A?
Yes. So thank you very much, Umit. These are great comments. I completely agree with you that the non-answers that we are considering is just a small subset of all the non-answers, just a small subset of all the non-answers out there. Especially, I like your suggestion about dodging. So with things like that, I'm really looking forward to the techniques which are able to figure out how to deal with this problem, but I completely agree with you on that. With Hollander, Pronk, and Rolson paper, yes, there's a paper which essentially did everything manually, tagged answers and non-answers. Their non-answers rate is lower than our non-answers rate. So kind of, we definitely capture in some phrases, some context which are not really non-answers, but we cannot filter them out, and that's why we are doing all this analysis. That's why we are doing all this analysis on the back end. All this analysis on the back end to essentially say, given the fact that this measure is so noisy, can we learn anything from this? And thank you very much for excellent suggestions on like sequencing, and if you're not answering, somebody just can keep on repeating questions. There's also scripting of conference calls, which is I'm choosing who is asking the questions in the first place. The suggestion about like exploring the features of the questions which they are unanswered is very interesting, because it's essentially, we assume certain things like proprietary information question, but then maybe there's something beyond there. And yes, so firm fixed effect is an important point. Call fixed effects, all the question answer will take care of it. So it's essentially kind of extreme level of fixed effects that can be included. Firm fixed effects in the competition regression, we essentially mostly kill competition. So that, yes, we should provide a better discussion of this in the paper, I agree. And then our ultimate goal is definitely to make this measure available, to make the code available, and to extend that street events or fact set would let us kind of post the derived data. We would be more than happy to do this. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Umit. Thank you for your time.